Hello, good morning to all of you IS members on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those across the rest of the country. And welcome to the 2020 Members Town Hall. I'm Jeff Braddock, the Independent Sector Board Chair, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's meeting. I know this is an incredibly intense time on so many dimensions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so particularly grateful for all of you joining today. I should also say I was thinking about past town hall meetings where they're usually in windowless hotel rooms. And maybe one of the benefits of this one is that, maybe you have a little natural light, unlike most of our past meetings. But it's great to have you all here. Let me also say that before we get started, we wanted to hear from some of our sector's leaders about the value of being part of the independent sector. And really kind of get a sense for the role this community plays in coming together and making sense of these times and in taking collective action to address some of the challenges and opportunities of this time. So we're going to see a brief video.
Imagine social justice in America without the independent sector, without the nonprofit sector and civil society. It is impossible for there to be justice in America without a strong, robust, and vibrant civil society.
For over 100 years, the nonprofit sector has been the catalyst for all social change in this country. From the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement of the past to the racial justice and environmental justice movement of today, the common thread has been the nonprofit sector and its leaders to bring about a more equitable and just society.
Nonprofit sector helps create a just and equitable society by focusing on the human experience of every part of our daily lives. And that focus really helps get at the heart of how people experience things differently, similarly, and what drives the difference in experiences.
The nonprofit sector has always been focused on those who are most in need, individuals who are marginalized by the systems, policies, and activities in our society. The nonprofit sector's work really does focus on a just and equitable society by looking at how can we change the systems, what supports do people need as individuals, and how do we come together collectively to create change.
What gives me hope is that I get to work in a sector where people can focus on the positive.
We really have to hold each other's hands and have each other's backs as we pivot and shift into a new way of doing business.
Nonprofits and philanthropic organizations must build community because our community is what will get us through this crisis. In a democracy, civil society plays an essential and critical role, a role of building resilience and building community at a time when people feel stressed, hopeless, and pessimistic. Our sector gives people hope.
The IS network is a great opportunity to bring all of the stakeholders from different parts of the nonprofit and the philanthropic sectors together to collaborate around common goals.
The independent sector community is so valuable to my work because in so many ways it challenges us to continue thinking bigger and broader and bolder than you would if you were just sort of in your silo on a daily basis.
I think the independent sector community is an important space for individuals and organizations to come together for shared learning and collective action.
I wanted to get to know people who were doing things other than, Latino empowerment. That work is core to what I do and to who I am. But I wanted to be able to compare notes with my colleagues who are doing work in a variety of different areas of expertise.
What gives me hope is being able to work with other nonprofit leaders through the independent sector. Despite if our missions are different, I found that our values across the sector are really aligned for racial justice and bringing about more equitable outcomes for Black and Indigenous people living in low-wealth communities. And that is really inspiring to me that we are collectively, as a sector, committing to equitable outcomes for all people.
We must focus on the health of the nonprofit sector, because as the nonprofit sector goes, so goes America.
Great. Thank you to IS for putting together that video. I think that final message of as the nonprofit sector goes, so goes America, I think is a powerful one and a deeply profound and true one. And so it's great to have the opportunity, as we're all sitting in different places, probably by ourselves in our houses or empty offices, having the chance to see leaders from the sector reflect back kind of their hopes and aspirations, and what the role of IS is in this process is really important, and kind of, I think, sets the stage for the conversation we hope to have today over the next hour and a half. As a matter of practice, I want to respectfully acknowledge that I'm joining you today from San Francisco in the Bay Area, the ancestral home of the Ohlone, the Cochenyo, the Karkens, the Ra-Maitush, the Yokuts, and the Ma-Wekma peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge that many of the buildings and places in this city were built with the labor of enslaved people. Finally, as we begin, I want to just hold a moment of silence for the more than 240,000 people who have lost their lives to COVID-19 in the US. I mean, it's very few times actually in American history have we had an ocean of loss and grief at a relatively short moment in time like this, particularly affecting BIPOC communities. So we wanted to just take a moment to reflect and hold those folks and all those they've touched in our thoughts and prayers. So thank you all for joining us. Let me offer a special thanks to fellow board members of Independent Sector for their leadership and contributions. They serve on, obviously on a volunteer basis, on our collective behalf, and really make a huge difference to the shape and direction of the sector. Let me ask board members to click the raise your hand feature so people can see kind of who is on the call on the Independent Sector Board. Give you a second to see who those folks are. Let me also take a minute to thank and congratulate the Independent Sector staff that, like so many in the sector and so many in America and around the world, have had to, all those words now that have entered the lexicon even more fully, like pivot and move, and so they've done just an amazing job over the last 10 months. And I just want to express my appreciation and the board's appreciation and the sector's appreciation for all you've been doing. If the staff could take a minute to raise their hands kind of online as well, that would be great. Great. Thank you all very much again for your work. As many of you know, this is the first time we're holding the business meeting of IS virtually, and so the rules of engagement and how we'll engage is a little bit different this year. So first, let me note that this meeting is being recorded. All the lines are currently muted, but please use the chat box at any point to let us know who's present in the organizations that you are representing. And also in the chat box, any questions along the way that you have, please share those. We'll try our best to respond to them in the meeting. If not in the meeting, we'll follow up to address any of those. Also, one of the parts of actually the in-person meeting is the opportunity to get together and provide time and space for networking and group engagement. And that actually will be part of this. So please stay on line for the back part of the meeting, where we will have the opportunity to get into small groups and get to know new people and leaders across the sector a little bit better. We'll also ask you at the end of the meeting to answer a survey, and we greatly appreciate if you would take the time to do that. It will really help us give shape to future meetings with all of us together. So let's go ahead and get started. I mean, I think it's fair to say, and I'll be very brief because all of us are living a somewhat common experience. It's obviously hitting different groups of people differently, some much more profoundly. But the pandemic, the economic disruption, the challenges to democracy, the racial uprising, fires, floods. I mean, this 2020 is a year that will not soon be forgotten. I mean, I often tell people that in the work that I do, where we often interview people, they will say, this is the most unique time in history. And I've heard that for 30, 40 years of various research I've done. And you're always kind of like, yeah, it is. But 10 years from now, we probably won't remember that. I think a century from now, we'll still be talking about 2020 on so many dimensions. And it's engendered a whole wave of feelings around fear and anger and possibilities in the midst of it all. And I think that, the civil society, just as we saw in that video, has played such a vital role in helping manage through this, both the immediate crisis, which continues. It's not over. Just watching the food lines on TV this weekend tells us kind of the stakes involved for so many in this country. But also in that video, we heard people talking about systems change, about the possibility of building back with equity, of building back in a different way, which is hard to hold both of those things because it's hard to hold a positive, where are we going when there's so much loss right now? But it really is the unique attribute of the sector and leaders in civil society and the social sector that are able to do that. So we're just grateful as independent sector to be able to be of service to you and to the work that you do, and to help create a context that lets you do your work most powerfully. You'll find in the report to members that we sent out on pages 32 to 34 of your meeting materials, kind of an updated highlights of the work. And Dan Cardinale, the CEO, will talk about this in just a moment, as well as how we're looking at 2021. You'll also find in the meeting materials IS's latest financial report, the 2019 audit report, and a variety of other things that give you kind of background and deeper dives on different parts of the organization. You'll also see from the agenda, there are a couple of governance items that we need to address. Here, usually these are the little slips of paper you pick up outside as you get your breakfast, and then you come to your table and we run around and collect them. We'll be doing that a little bit differently this time, but we need to make sure that we're doing these votes to be in compliance with our bylaws. And so the first item I'd like to get approval for is on the consent agenda, which is composed of two parts, this afternoon's meeting agenda and the minutes of the 2019 annual meeting. So if you should have a poll on your screen, if you could please fill that out. We will wait a minute for that, for people to do that, and then we'll move on. As that keeps going, I'll go ahead and move to the next piece, and we'll let this fill out. Let's see. Let me give you one. I'll give one more minute. Let me ask Gina, are we good to go to the next one?
So Jeff, this is Dan. I'm gonna end the poll, and we can move on.
Great, thank you. Let me go to the next poll. Thank you very much. Which is the election of the slate of first term and second term directors. So in the chat box, there will be a link to your ballot. And please complete all the information in the ballot that is asked for, but kind of as well as filling out this. And so I will wait a minute. This will take a minute for you to click onto and do. And it's just the Survey Monkey ballot. So we'll wait just 1 minute to make sure that we get all of those in to meet our bylaws requirement. So please, if you're online, please do take the time to vote on behalf of your kind of member organization. Great. It looks like we are good to go. Thank you very much for voting. And let me welcome our first term director candidates, Suzanne McCormick and Phoebe Boyer, and our second term director candidates, Nicole Anderson, Jennifer Reedy, Michael McAfee, and David Williams. We are greatly appreciative of your commitment to independent sector and to our collective well-being, and really appreciate kind of the work you've done for those that are entering their second term, and we welcome those that are just joining. Let me also now shift to two retiring board members who have done amazing work. I actually joined with them, I guess 8 years ago, Jim Gibbons and Ron Kagan. Jim was at Goodwill International, and just they have both contributed mightily to independent sector in a variety of ways, and really have shaped kind of who we are and the direction we've been going over these last several years. So thank you very much for all that you've done for all of us collectively. And we wish you well, and we look forward to seeing you in person, probably at the next meeting. Just great thanks to both. And just so folks know, I mean, I think Jim and Ron, but all the members of the board, I mean, just spend a tremendous amount of time invested in helping not their organizations, although there's a reverberating effect to their organizations, but really committed to helping the sector and all of us. So deep gratitude. Speaking of 2021, as we kind of introduce some new directors, I just want to share the board of directors has elected next year's officers. And you'll see those as follows on the screen here. And I know that we all are delighted with the opportunity to serve in these roles. And so that closes the governance portion of the meeting, kind of the formal piece that we need to do in the annual meeting. So thank you all for your patience in working through that. We now want to move into kind of the more substantive piece of the meeting about kind of what's going on in the sector, where it's going, where independent sector is going, as well as engaging all of you. Let me turn it over to Dan Cardinale, whose vision and commitment to others and to the sector has just been extraordinary through this time, and has led the independent sector team, again, that has done extraordinary work over this time as we move forward. And so let me turn it over to Dan to lead the conversation from here.
Jeff, thanks. And I want to thank you and the rest of the board. This has been an intense year for everyone, and the amount of time above and beyond the demands you all have navigating this that you've dedicated to independent sector and by extension to the entire sector has been remarkable. So I just want to acknowledge the kind of long hours, late nights, or weekend work you all have put in. It's been really extraordinary. So it is pretty self-evident, I think, that this has been a crazy year. I don't need to repeat it. The extraordinary thing is that it is a year of extremes. And certainly we've experienced that at independent sector. One of the things that I think was very clear to us is that starting really with the pandemic and then the killing of George Floyd, the resulting economic impact that we had, democracy, our economy, and the moment of racial reckoning kind of before us all at once in high relief. And what the senior team did as soon as this was hitting hard is we pulled back and asked what we're focused on, our core strategic drivers, and this population level result. Did it still apply? And we had over many years been kind of refining this notion that our job was to partner with organizations, operating organizations, other infrastructure organizations, philanthropy, nonprofits, to really, and the business community, to really see if we could unleash civil society as a transformative force so that all people thrive. And we're very specifically focused on ensuring that when we mean all, that it's those who are not. So Black, Native, people of color, those on the margins. And we don't mean survive, we mean thrive. So we have these three big strategies. Sector impact, we think about the health of the whole along with everybody else, but how strong and robust is civil society? And then we think about our contribution in bringing the sector together to kind of understand what's going on, and particularly to rework that community to be as inclusive as possible. And then finally, to see the interaction between this vision of a healthy sector, what the community is thinking and feeling and believing and learning, and then translate that into public policy so that the sector has the enabling structures, the systems that allow for it to really be fully itself so that all people can thrive. So we met and we said, you know, this still applies probably more now than ever in the midst of this crisis. And I have to say that we were in a situation that, because of the members, all of you who have either provided grants and or dues, have been partners, we had the bandwidth to be able to step into work that was highly adaptive. All of us have lived through this, like we got to reinvent ourselves and be responsive. And it was really because of a membership that has resourced us. We had the focus to be able to do that. So the first thing we did, and really have to give a shout out to both the board and the Public Policy Committee and our leadership with Jeff Moore at Independent Sector, we partnered with a whole group of leaders, and collectively, not just Independent Sector, but really through collective action, we were able to include the nonprofit sector in the Paycheck Protection Program, which effectively saved 4.1 million jobs. We got a temporary foothold on the charitable deduction. We were able to get funding for healthy elections, which turned out to be critically important. And we launched this kind of forward-looking role around how could civic infrastructure be part of building the country back out of COVID. And we have now stepped full-throatedly with the Biden administration to provide our best thinking, as we would have with the Trump administration had he won, about how the sector can be a resource. And one of the clear leaders throughout this period was the chair of our Public Policy Committee, Sarah Kostelik, who in her day job is the CEO of the National Indian Child Welfare Association, but has dedicated really, huge amounts of time. So I want to turn it over to Sarah to give a little bit of background on kind of what this year so far has looked like. Over to you, Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. Shamai, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be joining you, all of our members, to talk about the good work that we've been doing together over the last year, and to spend some time at the end of our session today planning for the future. As you know, independent sector's policy work has three core aims. And this year, with the deep engagement and guidance from our Public Policy Committee, we saw progress on each of these three. First, our goal to shape and advance a legislative agenda that both protects and promotes the needs and the health of the sector. We've made strides this year in partnership with organizations across the sector in making sure that COVID relief legislation accounted for the needs of many nonprofits. As Dan mentioned, in particular, the Paycheck Protection Program, which was a core win, and while not a perfect fit for the ways that nonprofits work, it saved millions of nonprofit jobs. And we got an important, though small, toehold on policies to increase charitable giving by way of a universal charitable deduction. But this work is far from done. Continuing to press Congress and the new administration on financial relief targeted specifically to nonprofits will be at the core of our work in the new year. Second is our goal to identify and to close gaps in our knowledge or data that prevent our progress on our core legislative priorities. The recently released Sector Health Report takes some major steps forward in identifying what we do and do not know about the sector's financial, human capital, governance, and advocacy health. The work of the policy team and of our committee is to identify what the policy agenda should look like with regard to filling those knowledge gaps: better or more accurate data, more regular data, better research structures, in service to increasing the sector's health. And third, to build the advocacy muscle of the sector, continuing to count the number of organizations that we can get to contact a member of Congress through our IS Action Center is a key measure of how effective we are in facilitating the sector's use of our voice in the policy process. So let me just share these numbers with you. In 2019, we had about 900 unique actions taken through our Action Center. And in 2020, there were over 75,000 actions taken. A core piece of our work in 2021 will be to determine how we best sustain the level of advocacy engagement when we hope we're not in a period of acute national crisis. Finally, in our role in shaping policy, we took on a critical piece of new leadership this year when we created, with our incredible partner Kaboom, the Nonprofit Infrastructure Investment Advocacy Group. The NIAG, as we call it, is an entirely new approach to coalition building by IS. The community is diverse by design, engaging nonprofit leaders who have traditionally never sat at our table. The NIAG is both building a case about the importance of investing in our civic infrastructure and simultaneously building out a broad new policy agenda that's aimed at helping our communities rebuild to a place better than before we encountered the health, economic, and racial crises of 2020. Advancing the policy aims of the NIAG will be a core focus for IS in 2021. And we're excited to see a number of other coalitions and sector leaders aligning behind that agenda. So we have some real concrete accomplishments to be proud of this year, and I've been honored to be a small part of this important work. I'll turn the floor back over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Sarah. And again, thank you for your leadership. It has been game-changing, to say the least. So the second thing that we focused in on was this notion of community building. And as you can imagine, like many of you on the call, we started the year with an in-person event that was going to take place in Pittsburgh, and we had to fundamentally shift. And it forced us to accelerate what we'd hoped to eventually lean into, which was to anchor in the in-person event of Upswell and our general community building, a virtual community. And so you can see here, we had really great progress in expanding radically the folks that we engage with through the IS events. We had over 13,000 people engaged and connected to the work, mobilized, as you heard from Sarah. And we were able to build for the first time these pop-ups, these smaller monthly events that collectively helped us, build these numbers of 13,500. For the Upswell Summit itself, we had triple what we had in Chicago, so almost 5,000 folks. And we really used the themes of COVID recovery and anti-racism, the themes of our day, to be the organizing principles. And with that, then you can see the speakers really represented the communities that were most affected by both of these forces in our country. And we increasingly listened to you. You heard Jeff at the beginning say, please fill out the survey. And we take these very seriously. And we've seen our net promoter scores really kind of rise over the course of the time as you provided us clear and strong feedback. And what we're hearing is that these themes have great resonance with you all, that these are the themes of our day, and we as a sector have to collectively figure them out. And in fact, that is our unique work and contribution to the rest of the country. And with that, I will turn it over to Terry Mazzani, who chairs the Community Building Committee and is a Senior VP at the Community Foundation in Atlanta. Over to you, Terry.
Thank you, Dan, and welcome everyone. On behalf of my committee members, I feel very fortunate that IS focused on community building as core to our work and had the foresight to elevate and reimagine this role, which is very timely for our work. The shift to reimagine the annual conference as Upswell had been well underway. And I think as other sectors of our society have seen, things like telemedicine, is it simply pushed us forward at a more rapid pace. You saw the numbers that Dan shared. And I think for many of us, we'll say, we don't really need to go back to business as usual. We have found new ways of connecting. And so how do we use this momentum through Upswell and our focus on regions and particular communities? So the Community Building Committee is continuing to deepen our models, our theory of change for community building, and to continue to position this as a key asset for independent sector as we continue with a time of tremendous polarization and division in our country, that it is independent sector that will bring us together. And we have the tools locally and national to do that. And so you'll see more of our work as we go forward through the end of this year and into 2021 to continue our reimagination of community building as a benefit for everyone who is part of independent sector.
Thanks, Terry. And so we also then had a breakthrough piece of work around our sector impact. And again, this was through the collective effort with Jeff Moore leading. And I have to give a shout out to Alan Abramson, who was really a resident scholar who helped us really craft this new report, which really takes a look at the health of the nonprofit sector. And it is a first edition, and it will improve and grow with your feedback. It's broken into 4 quadrants around human capital, governance and leadership, financial health, and policy and advocacy. And the goal of it is to, over time, to be a real organizing principle for our work around how we work collectively with you all, and how that then informs our public policy agenda for really ensuring that the sector is as robust and dynamic and this force where human thriving and environmental stewardship can take place. And then finally, I just want to give a shout out to the extraordinary staff at Independent Sector for incredible agility in partnering with you all. Shout out to AT&T Foundation and Nicole Anderson for bringing in 100 new members through a pilot program. Mackenzie Scott, as many of you know, made an investment that gave us the financial focus to be able to really be in service of the sector and focus on how we can drive that impact. Obviously your membership dues and your support continue to be critical. We put equity at the center of everything we do, and our partnership with the Annie Casey Foundation, the Results Count work, has really helped us to continue to focus on equity and turning outward outside the organization about what we can do. And our communications, you've probably seen with the leadership of Christina Gogri-Campbell, has really upped. We're out there, we're engaging with you on your behalf in terms of driving the voice of the sector into public policy and to the general population. Just one last, through Christina's work, we've become quite intentional about our community building. And again, this is in deep and we hope radical partnership with all of you, where we build with our core members and committee structures up and out to the members and their constituents, up to the kind of folks we bring in through the various events, with our general engagement of the sector through our emails and other services. And then you heard Sarah mention just how much web traffic and engagement we've had. And that's with this idea of really unleashing and caring for the health of all of civil society, again, in partnership with everyone. The one piece that I want to highlight is that this year we opened up our services outside of membership. And it was really because of your investment in the whole sector that enabled us to be able to do that. We are going to go back to a more closed community around membership and provide specific membership services starting in 2021. So we've heard a lot from folks like, well, why would I be a member if this is kind of available to the whole sector? And we thought this year, because of the just magnitude of the crisis, it was critical to do that. And now we want to really reward you all for putting time and energy into this community and unleash this community, as you can see at this very kind of center. And we'll continue to work on behalf of the whole of civil society. So at this point, we were going to do a little Q&A, but we are now substantially behind. And so I'm going to ask your indulgence that for those of you that do have questions, to go ahead and put those in the chat. And what we'd like to do is spend a little bit of time with the expertise that we have brought on through our partnership with Washington Council, Ernst & Young, and the partner there that is our real lead is Wes Cullum, who is here with us today to give us a bit of an overview on the elections. And then we'll have a panel discussion with two board members. Marco Davis, who's president and CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, serves on the Public Policy Committee and has a long history in the Obama administration and a number of other engagements. And then Sarah Kostelek will rejoin us as the chair of the Public Policy Committee. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wes to take it away, and I will. We can do some Q&A after that. Go ahead, Wes.
Great, thanks, Dan. Appreciate the introduction. I did have a couple of slides. I'm not sure if I can get them to show up on the screen or not. Let me see if I can do that real quick. A couple of quick slides here, just showing that think about the elections. Obviously, it's been a crazy and interesting year for the elections. We've already been 2 weeks out from the election day, and still have some outstanding issues regarding the race. I think all of you've seen in the press on the presidential side, President-elect Biden's been declared the winner. We still have kind of things waiting to be finalized, particularly in the Senate, with 2 races outstanding on the Senate side. Currently, it stands at 50 Republicans and 48 Democrats, with the Georgia races to be determined in a runoff in January 5th. And so we're still waiting to see that to be resolved as they proceed through the next couple weeks. In the House, you have some results still waiting to be finalized, but you have at least 6 seats gained by the Republicans, still maintaining control in the House by Democrats, but you have gains from Republicans in that side of the Congress, as well as some seats still outstanding. So narrow margins of the House. The Senate is outstanding until we get those 2 runoff races finalized on January 5th, which, as you know, could mean control of the Senate in the next Congress, depending on how those 2 races come out. Interestingly enough, the Purdue race between Ossoff and Purdue, Purdue won by about 86,000 votes. So very tight margins. You had a libertarian candidate at 114,000 votes, and so it could go either way. The runoff race with Loeffler and Warnock was even closer, with about a difference of 46,000 votes between the Republicans and Democrats in that long slate of candidates. And so that runoff will also be very, very tight in January. All right, some key dates to think about going forward. You have Electoral College dates to be certified December 14th, then delivered to Congress by December 23rd. Then you have the new Congress coming in on January 3rd. Then also we have the Georgia runoff on January 5th, which then will participate what happens and who controls the Congress in the next session. Going back to the Senate race, obviously thinking ahead for the agenda for the sector and the sector as a whole, with President-elect Biden coming in next year, the key will be who controls the Senate. That could take the agenda one of two different directions. If the Republicans win 1 or 2 seats in the Senate Georgia races, then they maintain control of the Senate, and Leader McConnell will be leader of the Senate and be able to dictate the agenda over there. That would then, I think, participate a couple, next 2 years at least, of power sharing, of negotiations, of the Democrats and Republicans having to work together to finalize legislation, move things through to the president's desk. And so issues of nature would have to be bipartisan. It would require compromise. And so it would be a year in which we wouldn't see, I don't think, large agendas being passed through Congress and to the president's desk by either Republicans or Democrats in that environment. However, if the Georgia races are won by the Democrats, they take up both seats in that runoff election on January 5th, then you have a 50-50 tie in January for the next Congress. And that means that the vice president, in this case, Kamala Harris, would be the tie-breaking vote on legislation going through the Senate. It means the Democrats could pass legislation to the House, move it through the Senate on a partisan basis, and then off to President Biden's desk to get it passed through. Obviously, it's a very different structure, a very different agenda for next year, and obviously very different outcomes that could take place in that environment. They were able to pursue legislation through reconciliation, which requires a simple majority vote. Obviously, the filibuster in the Senate is something that could be also challenged or modified to allow Democrats to move legislation through on a much easier path. And so obviously lots at stake in this Georgia runoff races in the Senate. Just a quick slide here talking about the first year of a new president generally pushes through, going back to Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama pushed through major legislation in their first year in office. Obviously that would be easier if the party in control of the White House controlled the House and the Senate. If there's split government, it wouldn't be as easy for him to move through his agenda, but you always see a new incoming president put forth big ideas and usually is able to move through some substantial legislation in their first year of office as they get through that first year. All right, what we see here is you also have some outstanding issues through the rest of this year, between now and December. The deadline really for activity is December 11th, when the current congressional resolution to fund the federal government expires. You also, as you know, have been negotiations taking place between the House and the President and also the Senate Republicans on a COVID relief package that's been stalled for several months in the House and Senate. There's activity going on right now to see if they can negotiate a final package. The sector has been active in trying to move that legislation, move provisions in that legislation through. They're still pretty far apart. You have the president and you have the Republicans in the Senate at about $500-600 billion in size of the package. You have Speaker Pelosi pushing a $2 trillion plus size package. So the question is, can they reach an agreement on something between now and December 11th on a smaller package? In my guess, the question will be: is Speaker Pelosi willing to come down in order to pass something through this year? Then maybe think about trying to do something next year in a follow-on package as well. You also have the appropriations bills that need to be finalized, an omnibus appropriations package by December 11th. or will that resolve into a CR that gets them through into March of next year? If they can't agree on a short-term pack or a bigger package for the year, do they do a short-term package into March of next year? That is really kind of the two issues on the table for the next several weeks in the lame duck session of Congress. Obviously, there's key points that we care about in the sector. Have been talked about before. In the COVID relief package, you have PPP expansions. You have also other funding and loan programs there. You have various spending items in both the COVID relief package and the appropriations package, whether it's childcare, broadband relief, et cetera. You have a lot of things kind of on the table. So the hope is that they can reach an agreement on some package between now and December 11th that would include some of the priorities from the sector as part of that. If not, we're going to be back at it come next year in 2021. So with that, I think I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions or
So if what I'd like to do, thank you very much, Wes, as always. It's super thoughtful. What I'd love to do is bring in both Sarah and Marco, each just to kind of respond from their point of view about what this means for them in their work and how they think about the nonprofit sector. And then if folks who want to ask Wes or Sarah or Marco a question, please put it in the chat. They'll be monitoring that and we can respond. So why don't I start, Sarah, in your role in the Public Policy Committee. I'd love your reflections on what Wes just said, in general, how you're thinking about this and what this might mean for the sector.
Great, thank you, Dan. And thanks, Wes, for that great presentation, as always. I think maybe the place I want to start is just with a couple of thoughts very quickly in honor of Native American Heritage Month. Thinking about the great organizing work that went into getting people registered and informed and prepared to vote, helping people have access to voting. So really great work on those fronts. Then when we think about participation in voting and the outcomes, again, the Native population just really broke records this year. So, fairly small population, 2% of the total US population, but representing 574 distinct federally recognized tribal governments, and over 70% of the Native population residing in major cities, and in key places really having a very powerful swing vote. So really wonderful outcomes, I think, just in terms of participation and in terms of having good outcomes for voting, with nonprofits playing such a critical role in supporting people in exercising their right to vote. So, looking at just some of the key states here, thinking about Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and in all of those places where the Native share of the electorate is actually bigger than the projected difference between the two presidential candidates. So really some true power there. And also true in key Senate races, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, and several House races. So exciting to see that kind of participation and the real power there. And then thinking about the actual outcomes and Native representation. So we're in a place now where we have 6 Native congressional candidates who won their races, several being reelected, but also several new members joining the House. So that's just fantastic. And a record number of Native candidates running in a variety of other races, including at the state level, 23, I think, in state Senate races and 50 in state House races. So just seeing more Native folks moving into this arena is fantastic. I think particularly with regard to the nonprofit sector and where this what the opportunity is right now is really to think about the kind of partnership between government and the Congress and the nonprofit sector. So really seizing the moment that we have here, the interest from the Biden administration, and really thinking about how to consistently and meaningfully incorporate a voice at the table for the nonprofit sector, and not just at this moment in time, but really thinking about the permanent role, the rightful place of such an important sector of our society in informing government policy and in thinking about bringing our shared wisdom from the community about the challenges and about the solutions to address those challenges, bringing those to government. I think there's just a tremendous opportunity for us here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And your leadership in carrying the water to this memo that we provided the Biden transition team has been key with a group of other folks. And with that, Marco, you are also on the Public Policy Committee. You're a seasoned policy guy. What's your take? What does this all mean for the sector, and how are you processing it?
Yeah, there's a lot. Thanks, Dan. There's a lot to unpack. There's a lot obviously still to be seen. Let me start sort of echoing the way Sarah did the approach to sort of mention the population I've worked with the most, and that I think has been the subject of a fair amount of conversation as well, which has been sort of the Hispanic vote, right? The so-called Latino vote. I think obviously what the elections confirmed was, the 60+ million people were a large population, and in fact turnout went up, highest turnout I think it's ever been for the Latino community. I think they closed some of the gap, but I think it still actually lags many other populations in terms of turnout rates. But similar to Sarah said, I mean, in true example of sort of the nature of coalitions, the turnout, the numbers also were measurably impactful on the margin of victory in several key states that were critical for Vice President Biden. On the one hand, in terms of Arizona as well, part of that coalition that was significant, as well as in Nevada, but also Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, and actually not even well known, given how close the race has been. I think even there was impact in Georgia. So that's a piece of the puzzle. Obviously, again, what's been said a lot, hopefully, I suspect most folks have seen headlines. There were huge surprises. The confirmation, again, what folks had known, but that folks didn't realize or truly understand, was that the population is not a monolith. The population does not behave as predictably or all to one side. And so in many ways, the number was also a significant contributor to the margin, if not enough to make up the margin of victory. They certainly obviously contributed. There's been tons of conversation around that in terms of Florida, right? And in terms of South Texas and keeping it from sort of turning blue. Some of the arguments are that the numbers, the ratio of Democrats to Republican voters wasn't where people expected it to be. And had it been where people thought it might have been, those states might in fact have flipped as well. And in terms of Congress, similarly, what also not much talked about, but fairly significant, particularly for my work, but also I think just in terms of how things will be playing out going forward. 3 members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, so 3 Democratic members, Democratic Hispanic members of Congress lost their races, 3 so far. I think there's 1 that still might not have been called. And 4 Republican Hispanic members of Congress gained. And this is actually fairly unique in that there hasn't been that much growth among Republican Hispanic members in recent years. And so again, that changes the dynamics fairly significantly. Connecting this to the work here at Independent Sector and sort of what we can take away from that, what we can think about. A lot of the conversation has focused, and again, Arizona is a really phenomenal example of this, of where as much as there was talk at the campaign, at the political party level, as much as there's been once again sort of a lack of sufficient investment in resources in places like Arizona, in places like Georgia, in places even like Nevada, it was groups including a significant portion of nonprofit organizations who've been doing organizing, not actually tied exclusively to election cycles in terms of the boom and bust, but rather sort of consistently grounding in community, engaging in conversation, building relationships, providing actual resources and support services to community members to build that trust and to be that safety net and to be advocates, right, and representatives of those communities as needed. That actually was part of what allowed, what made for successful civic engagement, encouraging people to turn out, to show up, and to vote. And there's even a lot of postmortem now, for example, about Texas, about the nature of, again, the way that the political parties in some ways were taking the population for granted, and that it was actually nonprofit efforts in many ways that swayed people's minds and awakened them to different ideas. Looking forward, I think for the Latino community, but really for everyone, I think, and as Wes's presentation pointed out, I mean, I think what will be most beneficial and where I think our organizations and our sector can really be most effective is bringing the focus, now that sort of the election and the drama of all of that has largely passed, even though the runoffs, as Wes pointed out, are still pending, bring the focus back to sort of core needs, right? The critical needs. And as you've just talked about in terms of independent sector, and I would argue the overall sector's real focus in terms of underrepresented populations who have been most critically affected by the pandemic, who are most represented in the manifestations of activity around social justice that emerged this summer. It's bringing folks back to sort of saying, how are we weaving together our society? How are we looking out for those of us who are feeling the effects, whether it be of the pandemic itself, health impacts, or economic impacts, and reminding people that those core needs are what both the sector does and what we as a nation need to do, that government needs to step up with. And I think that in many ways can be a really effective vehicle for advocacy and for presence at the conversation, being that, again, as Wes pointed out, in many ways, these core economic issues and of course the pandemic are going to be top of mind in terms of agendas, regardless of how the Senate plays out, and certainly for the Biden administration. And so I think doing that is one key piece. And the only other thing I'll say, because it's what I do, I think there's a need, and again, the sector can potentially demonstrate, can model sort of good behavior about serious commitments to increasing representation, right? That's the other game that's played in Washington. For those of you not here right now about sort of this incoming administration and political appointments and cabinet members and so on, there's a lot of conversation about who will be at the table. And that's the visible optical kind of conversation. But I think, again, as the Public Policy Committee and the NIAG and other folks can really point out, what doesn't make headlines and doesn't make sort of the news talk television conversation, but is absolutely critical, is all the other jobs that are not headlines, but that are actually driving, creating, crafting policy and regulations, right? And I think getting folks who A, represent the diversity of America, but B, also understand the role the sector plays, I think is something really critical, right? So that memo we wrote is really a good framework and provides a really good macro level kind of approach to how the sector could and should be engaging with the administration. I think the ways in which that memo can be brought to life and the ways in which the goals of that memo can be implemented are through building relationships with the many, many different staff at all of the federal agencies, as well as with Hill staff, to ensure that the ideas that we're talking about, actually where the rubber meets the road, actually play out, right? When grants are distributed, when regulations are created, when programs are launched and piloted, making sure that we're seen as a partner, and it's not exclusively what I feel like is the headline story, that it's like all about business, the business sector and small business, which absolutely is critical. But as we know, our sector is one of the largest employers as a sector in the nation, and therefore making those connections, I think, are key. And I'll stop there.
Oh, it's great. So we do have a question that came in from a fellow board member, Janine Lee, who, puts I think a really important question. This is open to everybody. The integrity of the elections is being questioned. We have a president nearly 2 weeks later that has not conceded. What will this mean for future elections? And how do we, as a sector, find a way forward?
Any takers? I got to guess if nobody has a.
I can take it.
Sure.
This is Wes, Margot, but I think that, it's right. There's no question the current environment is, challenging for the electoral system overall. But as you know, it's kind of done by state, right? So the question is can this experience be learned from and used as a way to get the states and the federal government to be better partners in trying to make sure the way that it works is safe, right, and secure, and the states have the ability to kind of do some best practices, I think, on a going forward basis.
Absolutely agree with Wes. And the two things I'll add briefly are, one, I'm optimistic that I think the current president has been kind of this X factor that I think has jumbled, all conventional wisdom, frankly, in all areas. And I'm hopeful that even here, this question that, again, he is particularly unique in sort of driving this doubt, sowing this doubt, right? In the questioning and doing these unprecedented actions, for example, is not conceding and so on, even as he pursues the absolutely legitimate legal avenues, right? So I like to think that sort of without him as a variable in office, I think some of that may diminish because again, the attention and not to mention the infrastructure he has at his disposal will be diminished. Second, though, I think whether or not that happens, and I think there are obviously has been proven a really core and how durable it'll be, but there's been proven that there's a core set of followers who will take his direction, I think, regardless of whether he's in an office or not. The one thought and suggestion I have, especially that I think our sector can do really well, is to help, essentially, for lack of a better term, sort of humanize the concept of government for people, right? I think in many ways, the electoral process has been undermined because it's been abstracted, right? It's this idea of like this random corrupt system where people are somewhere in a dark room counting things and creating, you know, and fake ballot and all of this stuff. And they're not real people. And I think, again, our sector can, and to Wes's point about how elections really happen state by state, and when you really break down county by county, I think, again, that our sector has been often among the best to sort of really point out, like, the county registrar is so-and-so who lives in such and such town, right? You know who that is. That's not some random Washington fat cat person who's like who's a cartoon character villain, right? It's actually government is us. And sort of reminding people of that, I think, might help to bring back some of the faith in the core elements of our democracy. Because again, realizing that our democracy is actually us, the people, not these random, you know, shady, shadowy power players off in a distant land making all the decisions.
Yeah, this is Michael.
Oh, hey, Michael, fire away.
Hey, good to see everyone. I'll just add that I think our sector has a role to play in the standards that it will project, whether it can influence them or not. Our silence in allowing so much of the harm that happens in this nation to go without a response from the sector validates the emergence of folks like Trump, you know? And so I think if we learn some things from this sector, I mean, from this moment, I think it is for us to think about what would it mean for our sector to begin to say, you know, these are just basic things that we expect. Folks may not listen for a while, but that's besides the point. The point is that this sector will stand for something, that it will stand for a democracy that can operate unobstructed, for everyone to be able to participate, that particular harms that we see out there in the world, that we're going to speak out on them. To me, that is not a political issue. It's a standard for us to set for what we want to see in our nation. And I think I'm talking about we as a sector, not IS. We can try to become so politic and so bipartisan, using that word loosely, that we don't stand for anything. And yet we then are appalled by so much. And so I think if we're appalled by it, we ought to say something about it as a sector and stop waiting till we get in these moments and then looking at each other aghast that we got here. We got here because we've been silent. We got here because we basically said, you know what, it's okay to do certain harm to people and nothing's gonna happen. Folks won't even speak on it. And I think given the voice that you're projecting, Dan, and the amazing work of IS, I think it's an opportunity for us to push our sector and all the subsets of it to say, what does a standard of civility, of community look like in this nation that transcends politics that we can talk about, right? And all uphold. To me, that's what I think is really an amazing opportunity for us as IS leading that. What's the standard of community and of civility that can be upheld regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum? And I think if we do that, I think we'll begin to usher in another generation of folks who appreciate civil society, who appreciates what Marco was talking about around governing. But without that, I think we're going to run the risk of another generation tuning out, which will be quite dangerous.
Thank you, Michael. And again, just a reminder, folks, Michael wears multiple hats, one of which is an IS board member and on our chairs the Gardner Committee, as well as on the Community Building Committee. We've got just a couple minutes. I want to give, particularly Sarah, you an opportunity to talk about the NIAG that Marco mentioned. So we know that regardless of how Congress is going to fall out in the Senate, that we've built an agenda around where we want to see the country as, hopefully now with 2 vaccines, we can begin to finally imagine that there may be a movement through the pandemic and where we want to go. Can you just give folks a little bit about the NIAG, and then, what to Michael's point, the difficult task of prioritizing, what we stand for and how we might proceed, realizing it's just on the fly here.
Thanks, Dan. Right. So, I think the NIAG was conceived of as an intentionally very different way of doing business. So,
can I just interrupt? I apologize.
Yeah.
I should have said the National Investment Infrastructure Advisory Group.
Thanks for help with our alphabet soup.
Yeah, right. This is DC for sure, right?
And it's in the materials, I think, right, as I recall.
It is in the materials, yes. And we'll put a link in the chat in just a second so people can see.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a really intentionally different way of doing business for IS. And I think it's even striking how different it was from how we worked together at the beginning of the pandemic to develop some legislative priorities and try to impact what was definitely a fast-moving train. But if you contrast the longer time horizon that we've had now, since May, I believe we've been meeting in a really structured way, inviting whoever wants to come to the table to have a series of conversations about how we both make the case for why we need to be talking about the infrastructure to support civil society at the same time we're talking about bridges and roads and airports. So making the case for why we have a role in that conversation and why our capacity and our infrastructure matters, to be making the case at the same time we're talking about what the priorities are from the sector. So thinking about things like the health of our democracy, what powers our democracy, what allows people to vote, what facilitates people's ability to volunteer, gives them the ability to do that, and to donate their dollars in addition to their time in ways that make sense for them. So really thinking about broadly all the aspects of civic participation and the kind of infrastructure that are necessary for our communities to come together, for us to unleash our ability to collectively problem solve, to apply our local wisdom to how to meet the challenges that we face and what the true solutions are. So I think there's a real opportunity through this work that has kind of transpired in a pretty structured way, where people are coming together every other week, identifying buckets of infrastructure, talking about what kinds of things fit there, and then really trying to come to some priority around thinking about those most impacted, those most on the margins, and how we help to lift up those people and communities in a way that ultimately create more equity and allow for all people to thrive.
Thanks, Sarah. So we could go on and should, but we have to keep our time boundaries. I've got Gina here on Slack telling me we got to close out. So first of all, thank you, Wes, for the overview, Sarah and Marco for your leadership on the board and the passion with which you bring kind of really deeply values-driven work at the level of all of civil society and this incredible threading of a needle that we all have to do. And echoing Michael's point that we want to stand for something. We don't want to just be kind of wishy-washy. We actually want civil society to hold the health of every person so we can thrive. So thank you all very, very much. And we have one last thing. I'm going to turn it back over to our board chair, Jeff Braddock. I'll come in at the end, but I just want to thank you all for joining us. And Jeff, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. Again, let me just encourage everybody that's here to stay deeply involved. As you can tell from just this last very brief snippet of conversation, a lot of really important issues at stake for the sector, for kind of how we move forward, for how we make the world a more just and equitable place. So please stay engaged. You will see in the chat, there is a reminder if you haven't voted for the slate of candidates. Please do that. Take a minute to click on to the SurveyMonkey to do that. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we're going to end this with a brief networking event where you'll be able on screen to join a group. Think of this as a much better version of that awkward moment when you walk into the ballroom at a lunch and you're trying to figure out, like, where should I sit? Do I join that table? I'm not quite sure what to do. Here, all you need to do is just, like, when it comes up, click into a group and join, because some of the highlights I know for many of us at these meetings are the unexpected people that we meet that we never knew before, and you sit down next to them, and that you then have a relationship as you move forward. So please join the group. And unless there are any other matters, also there's a survey in the kind of a survey about the meeting. So please join that. So please join a group. And unless there's other matters, this concludes the 2020 Members Town Hall. Thank you.